Hello and welcome to the Goodwill Tax program. We are going to cover filing requirements in this video, and this can be found on tab A of your 4012 that you will have received from GoodTAXES. So filing requirements. So that would lead you to believe that not everybody needs to file a tax return. And that is true. Not everybody does need to file a tax return. But here's three things we need to consider when we are making a decision whether somebody has to or does not have to file a tax return. One thing we want to consider is the taxpayer's age, because age is going to play a role in whether the taxpayer has to file a return. The next thing we want to consider is filing status. Now, we haven't learned about filing status, but we're going to learn about filing status, and that's another consideration. The third thing we want to consider is the taxpayer's income level. Once you reach a certain income level, the law does require you to file. And so you're going to notice as I go through the next several slides, I'm going to reference what page in your 4012 you can find this information on. So everything that's in these slides is something I have pulled out from the 4012, and you have access to that. You have access to that in a paper format. You have access to that online. So these slides will correspond to certain pages in the 4012. So page A3, you're going to find this chart, which is chart D, who should file. Now I want to highlight the words here. It's who should file. This is not who must file. This is who should file. And so certain taxpayers don't have to file, but they probably should file because they're going to get the money back that they paid in, or maybe they're going to get some other benefit from filing. And so those are taxpayers who should file, and you can find that on page A3. Also on page A3 is chart C. Now this chart highlights situations when a taxpayer must file. So this is not should file. These are situations where a taxpayer must file. And so you should look at your 4012 and look at those situations if you have somebody who is not sure if they need to file or not file. So we said, as we were looking at the beginning slides, we said that age and filing status and income are three things that determine if somebody must file. So on page A1, there is a chart for most people who must file, and it addresses age, filing status, and income. It addresses those three pieces. So let's say we've got a filing status of single, and there are 5 filing statuses, and those 5 filing statuses are specific to people who fall in certain categories. And so let's say I have a taxpayer who falls into the category of filing single. And let's say that taxpayer is under 65 years old and their gross income is less than $12,000. They would not have to file a tax return unless there is something about this chart that says that they need to file. But our taxpayer generally, who is single under 65 and has gross income under $12,000, would not need to file. So if we look at this list, we can see that you can make quite a bit of money as a taxpayer and not have to file taxes. So here we've got somebody who's married filing jointly. Both taxpayers are 65 or older, and they can make $26,600 before they would need to file. I also want to highlight this. Married filing separately, any age, must file a return if they make $5. Okay, so this little chart is going to be helpful. It's on page A1 to determine if somebody needs to file based on their age their filing status, and the amount of income that they have. Now, we have a category of the tax form for dependents, and the rules are a little bit different for dependents, and we find this chart on page A2. And it says if your parent or someone else can claim you as a dependent, then you need to use this chart. So we wouldn't use this chart if we were a dependent of somebody else. We would use this one. So let's move right in then to the different filing statuses. We're going to find that on in section B, where it's going to highlight the different filing statuses. So we have 5 filing statuses: single, married filing jointly, married filing separately, qualifying widower with a child, and then head of household. Those are the only 5 filing statuses that we have, and everybody has to fall into one of them. So this page on B7 of your 4012 is a fantastic page for determining filing status. It walks you through a decision tree that pigeonholes your taxpayer into one of the 5 filing statuses. And so this is very helpful when you're doing things like taking the VITA exam. It would be helpful if you have a problem dealing with filing status. So let's talk about these 5 filing statuses. The first one we have is single. This is the absolute last filing status you would choose. You would choose a different one if anything better applied. But if we have a taxpayer who is unmarried, or a taxpayer who's legally separated according to state law under a divorce decree or separate maintenance, and a taxpayer who does not qualify as a qualifying widower or head of household, then they would have to file as single. And so single is the default for if you don't qualify to file any other way. What other ways could you qualify to file? You could qualify as married filing jointly. So a taxpayer who is determined married at the last day of the tax year can file as married filing jointly. So what if they were single all year and they got married on December 31st? They would be considered married for that tax year. There's no prorating. It's whatever you are on the last day of the tax year is whatever you are. So if you are getting divorced and your divorce happens on December 31st, it's completed on December 31st, then you are single or you are unmarried for that entire tax year. Whatever happens or whatever you are on the last day of the tax year is what you are. So each spouse is going to be liable for the entire tax liability in a married filing joint scenario. So there could be situations where taxpayers don't want to file jointly even though they are married. And so then we have the married filing separately status. And so if you are married filing separately, that removes that liability from the entire amount of tax owed. You would only be responsible for your amount of tax owed as a separate taxpayer. So married filing separately, certain couples choose to file separately. For certain couples, there's actually a tax advantage in filing separately. There are lots of disadvantages for married filing separately tax status, but some taxpayers do benefit from it. Now, let's say that you were married and your spouse died. We have the qualifying widow or widower filing status, and that qualifying widow must have a child. So the qualifying widower status is available for 2 years, the first 2 years following the year the spouse died. So if the spouse died in 2016 or 2017 and the spouse did not remarry, they would file under this filing status. If taxpayer paid over 50% of the household cost of a qualifying person, they would be able to file under this filing status. If the spouse died, but there was no qualifying person that our widow or widower is taking care of, they would not qualify for this filing status. So the taxpayer filed a joint return with the deceased spouse in the year of death, or they could have filed a joint return. So this assumes that our taxpayer filed a joint return with their spouse in the year that their spouse died, and then the 2 years after, they can file under this filing status. So if the taxpayer's spouse died in 2018, the taxpayer is considered married for 2018, regardless of when the spouse died. So I said that with the qualifying widower filing status, we must have a qualifying person in order for us to use that filing status. Obviously, that filing status is a better filing status than the single filing status, but we have to have a qualifying person. So the taxpayer has a child or a stepchild that the taxpayer can claim as a dependent. This does not include foster children or grandchildren. So it has to be a child or a stepchild in order to qualify to file under this filing status. The child must have lived in the taxpayer's home for all of, that should say 2018, for all of 2018. And if there is a temporary absence, if the child has a temporary absence because they've gone away to school or they've got vacations or some medical or business type of arrangement, that doesn't count as being gone. The taxpayer would still consider this a qualifying person even if those types of circumstances arose. And the last filing status is the head of household filing status. And so the head of household filing status applies to unmarried individuals, or it could apply to married individuals who are considered to be unmarried. So we have this hard and fast rule, right, that if you are married on December 31st, you have to file either married filing jointly or married filing separately. However, there are circumstances when a taxpayer, even though they are married, is considered unmarried. What are those circumstances? So if the taxpayer lived apart from his or her spouse for the last 6 months of the year, that would be considered eligible to file under the head of household filing status. In addition, the taxpayer must have paid over half the cost of keeping up the home for the year, and the taxpayer's home must have been a home, the main home, for the taxpayer's child, stepchild, foster child, more than half the year. So the taxpayer would claim this child as a dependent, or the child's other parent would claim him as a dependent or her as a dependent, but they would still be living under the taxpayer's roof and they would be considered the head of household. So on page B8, there is a chart on who is a qualifying person, qualifying you to file as head of household. So remember that the qualifying widow or widower has a qualifying person, and that qualifying person is specifically defined for that filing status. And then we also need a qualifying person for head of household, and that person is specifically defined in this chart here. So that's filing status. Thank you for watching and have a great day.